Hello, and welcome to Things We Said Today, our bi-weekly podcast about anything and everything to do with the Beatles, collectively and individually, past, present, sometimes even the future. I'm Allan Kozinn, the author of The Beatles from the Cavern to the Rooftop and Got That Something, How the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand Changed Everything, and co-author with Adrian Sinclair of These Guys, the McCartney Legacy, Volume 1 and 2, and we're working on 3. I'm joined by my two regular co-hosts, Ken Michaels, who you know is the host of the syndicated Beatles radio show Every Little Thing and co-host of the Beatles podcast Talk More Talk, solo Beatles podcast, I should say, Talk More Talk. And he also has his own YouTube channel, Ken Michaels Radio, which is packed with Beatles related interviews and stuff. So you should check it out. Ken, how's it going?
Going great. How are you doing, Alan?
Pretty good. And also Darren DeVivo, who's been a DJ at WFUV FM 90.7 in the New York area since February 1984. And if you're not in New York, you can hear him and everything else from WFUV at WFUV.org, and they have an app. He'll tell you later. Hello, Darren.
Hello, Alan. How you doing, Ken? And now you got to start saying, and also on Talk More Talk with Ken.
That's right.
Oh yeah, this is you've done your first one already, right?
I will admit to something here.
Yeah.
One show, and then there was a quickie that we drew together that had Tom Frangione on talking about McCartney shows at the Bowery Ballroom. And I never did talk with Ken about this. I'll share with everybody. I kind of had the time wrong. And I dialed in for the interview about an hour after it was over. So I had a conversation with myself for the second show. But yes, we've done one show with me, and I've missed one already. So I'm in detention.
Well, we're now, even though it's a bi-weekly show, there will be times we'll throw in some extra shows, which may be shorter than our normal programs. They don't always have to have all four of us.
Right.
Oh, but, you'll get more
Yeah.
with talk now
I,
than just every
mhm.
2 weeks.
Okay.
But I'm thrilled and honored, and it's, very cool. Anyway.
All right.
Fit right in.
So today we are going to be speaking with Seth Rogovoy, who has a new book, Within You, Without You. It's listening to George Harrison as a subtitle, and it's about George's music. And he'll be joining us later. But first, we have the news from Ken.
All right, thanks, Alan. First of all, we must acknowledge two very important birthdays. On February the 18th, Yoko Ono turned 92. God
Hmm.
bless her. And tomorrow, since we're recording this on the 24th, George Harrison would have turned 82. Depending on when you celebrate his birthday, whether it's the 24th or the 25th, he would have been 82. Ringo Starr performed at the Grand Ole Opry on February the 21st, last Friday, and he performed 3 songs. And in his band, you had Greg Bissonette on drums. Molly Tuttle was there, as was Ketch Sekor and Daniel Tashian. And the first two of the songs were with Molly Tuttle. He did Time on My Hands from Look Up, plus he did Act Naturally and with a little help from my friends. And this entire performance you can catch on YouTube right now. Ringo also showed up at the Musicians Hall of Fame on February 19th, where a new exhibit called Beats and Threads features Ringo's memorabilia. And it opened the following day. Ringo was at a private press event and ribbon cutting ceremony the previous day. And on display are Ringo's curated drum kits, sticks and snares, personal documents, and era-defining style statements that made music and fashion history. The exhibit is sponsored by Julian's, the industry's leading rock and roll memorabilia auction house, and a hardcover limited edition book of the same name, Beats and Threads, was recently released, which you can purchase through Julian's. And also the Musicians Hall of Fame and Museum in Nashville. Okay. Now, a date has been set for Ringo's concerts at the Ryman Theater in Nashville for the TV special of that, and that will be on March the 10th on CBS. So mark that down. March 10th, Ringo at the Ryman on CBS. Ringo Starr will be starting another All-Star Band tour in June, but now we hear he'll start another leg in September. While no new dates have been announced for that, he will be playing the 2025 Bourbon and Beyond Festival. This is in Louisville, Kentucky on September the 13th. The festival lasts 4 days and takes place at the Highland Festival grounds at the Kentucky Expo Center. Who did I get for that for news? None other than our own Darren DeVivo. How did you find out about the other leg of Ringo's All-Star Band tour? Because I didn't see that mentioned anywhere.
I made it up.
Oh, okay. All right.
No, I got a geez, you want me to remember? I don't remember anything. It was I think like an online music magazine made mention of it, and then I went to look. The one thing I found a little strange about it was that Ringo, I don't know if you did, I'm sure you did a little fact checking,
Mhm.
especially since you found out about it from me. You
Right.
probably thought I best check his stuff. Um, his Ringo's name was kind of like low in the
I saw that.
yeah, and I thought to myself, I hope that I've gone on said I think I posted on Facebook. I hope it's not like kind of a half truth. And but his name was there. I would have thought it would be up higher in the listing, but I
The
then saw it a
website.
second time. But
Yeah.
and it was going to be part of another leg, but there's I guess been no formal announcement yet. Another leg of 2025 All-Star Band tour.
Well, it wouldn't surprise me. But on the website for the Bourbon and Beyond Festival, his name is on there.
Yeah, but it isn't like is
Right.
it? Yeah, it's kind of down under the
Yeah.
headliners.
I'm just saying that because you didn't mention where you found that, but it's
Yeah,
on there.
I couldn't remember honestly.
Yeah. Okay. You probably know this by now, but something to remember because it's an exciting time on the John Lennon side of things because we have the one-to-one documentary coming out in IMAX theaters. That's on April the 11th. And then another John Lennon documentary, Borrowed Time, which is all about the last decade of John's life, that will premiere in movie theaters on May the 2nd. So they're about 4 weeks apart, two documentaries being in movie theaters on John. And you could actually watch trailers for both of those documentaries on YouTube. Borrowed Time, I saw has Earl Slick in it, Tony Bramwell, and our good friend Ken Womack is in that documentary as well. So exciting times there. 2 months in a row with John Lennon documentaries. Peter Asher will be performing at a benefit concert for the California wildfires called Let's Get LA'd. LA laid. So it sounds
Okay,
like let's get laid, but it's LA'd, like Los Angeles, LA.
there's, there's
An
children
evening-
watching Ken.
Got it.
This is an evening of music and comedy. Happens March 16th at the United Theater in Los Angeles. Others on the bill include Al Jardine, Weird Al Yankovic, Eric Idle, Margaret Cho, Rufus Wainwright, and Paul Schaefer. We can put the link in our description box for this if anybody is interested in attending this. A reminder that David Sheff's new book, Yoko Biography, comes out March the 25th. A new book just released is called Ribbons of Rust. The Beatles Recording History and Context, Volume 1, July 1954 through January 1963. This is by Robert Rodriguez and Jerry Hammack. You know Robert from the Fab Four FAQ books that he put out, and also a really good book on Revolver. Jerry Hammack wrote 5 books. I always have some near me. This whole series, the Beatles Recording Reference Manual, covering all the Beatles recordings as a group, goes into detail how every song was recorded. So the two of them teamed up together for this book, which explores the music and sounds the Beatles were discovering in their developing years along with the times they inhabited. It's not just the American artists that affected them, but the British music scene and the stars of that time as they found their way to making their first record. Amazon describes it as though you are in the room with them from the first Liverpool recording at the Percy Phillips facility to Forthland Road, the Hamburg sessions with Tony Sheridan, Decca, and Parlophone. It's already been released, and I understand it's on paperback. Ribbons of Rust.
Does it say why they start in July 1954?
Doesn't say that on Amazon.
Because I was born in July 1954, so I mean, it must
You
be
should
that.
be in the book then. Maybe it's because they usually say the rock and roll era started around that time. They usually signal Bill Haley Rock Around the Clock in 1955 or maybe right before that. So when rock and roll was starting to develop. I don't know. That's my guess. But two great authors right there teaming up together. Now, two of the Beatles' sons are working together. On February 14th, James McCartney posted a photo of him and Zach Starkey after a recording session. Zach has a band out called Mantra of the Cosmos. And Zach, by the way, recently had to cancel gigs with the band because of a blood clot he had in his leg. And he was told to rest a couple of weeks for that. I don't know what they recorded together, Zach and James, but I guess it's going to be released by the band, Mantra of the Cosmos. I know that Noel Gallagher of Oasis is in that band
Oh,
with
wow.
Zach. All right. Julian Lennon will have a new exhibit of his photography called Reminiscence, described as Julian's fine art photography showcasing popular favorites as well as never before seen images. It will open the evening of March the 6th at the Freeman Gallery in New York City and will run until April the 6th. If you can't make it to the exhibit, you can view some of the works in a virtual gallery on Julian's own website, julianlennon.com. And on Julian's birthday, April the 8th, he will have another photography exhibit opening at the Still Gallery in Milan, Italy. It's called Whispers 2, TOO, and that includes works originally shown last year at Whispers, a Julian Lennon retrospective in Venice. The one in Milan will run through May the 30th, and admission for that is free. Remember, Julian also just released a new book of his photos called Life's Fragile Moments. Dark Horse Records will be releasing a new album from Benmont Tench. It's, well, Benmont, you know, for his years with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. He's also appeared on some of Ringo's solo recordings. Benmont's new album will be called The Melancholy Season, and that's due out March the 7th. And our friend Fernando Perdomo just recorded a new cover of the Beatles song, Now and Then. You can catch his video for the song on YouTube where he plays all the instruments, and you can purchase the recording at fernandoperdomo.bandcamp.com. Finally, some very sad news to report about the legendary singer Roberta Flack passing away. Roberta is best known for her beautiful singing voice and for her classic hits, The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face, Killing Me Softly with his song, and also Feel Like Making Love. Apart from sharing the Dakota building with the Lennons, Sean, I know, said recently, Sean Lennon, that she was a close friend. She also recorded an album of all Beatles songs called Let It Be Roberta. Roberta Flack sings the Beatles, which I have right here. When it first came out, I gave it away as a prize on my website. I'm going to bring it back and give away copies because I still have a few copies left.
I believe that ends up being her last album.
Was it?
I believe so.
Okay. Well, she had been suffering with ALS the last couple of years, and it made it difficult for her to sing and talk. Roberta Flack was 88 years old. Very sad to hear about her. Legendary singer right there. That's all the news I have for you.
Okay, thanks, Ken. And so we will head over past the swirly thing to have a chat with Seth Rogovoy. Okay, and as promised, we have a guest with us. As you can see, it's Seth Rogovoy, who is has written a number of music books, including one about Bob Dylan, prophet, mystic, poet. He did a book about klezmer music as well, um, and his new book is Within You, Without You, and we all have copies. Listening to George Harrison, and it's not a biography. It's really sort of a look at George's work and what's behind it. And well, Seth will tell us all about it. So, Seth, welcome to Things We Said Today. It's great having you here.
Thanks, Allan and Darren and Ken. It's great to be here.
Okay, so what we usually do is we sort of, I'll ask a few questions and then pass you on to Ken, and Ken will pass you on to Darren, and we'll see how far we get if we do further rounds. Um, I guess, I mean, the obvious place to start is why George, and just guessing a little bit. I mean, your Dylan book also is sort of, focusing on, his sort of mystical poet side, and I have a feeling that you are attracted to people who write music and that uses a sort of, spiritual basis as at least part of what they do. So what gave you the idea to do this book and why do it this way?
Right. Well, that's certainly an aspect of it, which I didn't think of up front, but now that I have these three books, all of them about some relate somewhat to music and spirituality. It's not like I went after the Dylan book, okay, who else can I do about music and spirituality? Because, as you know, the book, although that's an element of it and an important element, and it was certainly a significant element in George Harrison's life and his music, so all that attracted me. It was only a part of many things that attracted me to George, which I'm happy to iterate if that's something you'd like me to do.
Sure, go for it.
So, yeah, I was always, since I was even a kid, I think I was always drawn to George for a number of reasons. Um, could just be because, my parents had Revolver and, the first track is Taxman and a George song. First time a George song led off a Beatles album. My father was a CPA, so there was a little more of a personal connection to Taxman, and but the thing with George always struck me as so interesting. I won't say the most interesting, although yeah, to me he is the most interesting, but I could see how somebody else might feel, you know, especially that John Lennon might be just as interesting. And of course, not to not to underestimate Paul McCartney, who I think, if there's one thing I came out of this entire experience, it's a hugely enhanced appreciation for Paul McCartney.
Hmm.
And but all of them are fascinating and integral and essential to the Beatles. Maybe that's just goes without saying, but just to be clear, that's the way I feel. I don't feel that, George was the most important. You couldn't have had the Beatles without any of the four of them.
Right.
George was just, such a walking contradiction in a way. He had ambivalent at best feelings about fame and celebrity. And he his songs to me, both in the Beatles and then in his solo career, I think what I was another thing that really drew me to his songs are how personal they almost all are. He really wrote for either from situations in his life or thoughts and ideas and experiences, and from his heart, perhaps in a way that was different. When I look back on it, I think, when we use the term singer-songwriter, we usually, that was a term that I think came to be used more in the 1970s with the so-called confessional singer-songwriters like James Taylor, Carole King, Carly Simon, Leonard Cohen. But really, in some ways, I mean, obviously the original confessional singer-songwriters, although they weren't called that, were Bob Dylan and Paul Simon. But I think George Harrison is right there with them in doing something that was very different from what other people were doing and what the other members of the Beatles to a large extent were doing. When they're singing I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You, yeah, 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 he's singing Leave Me Alone, Don't Bother Me, which, we could go into in much greater depth. But I throw all these things out as just things that to me were fascinating, worth exploring. And it goes on throughout his career. And so those are all things that attracted me to George, as well, as his songs, his singing, and his playing, obviously.
Okay, so you mentioned "Don't Bother Me" as like the first of his songs that any of us would have heard. Probably the first one that exists. I don't think there's any George Harrison juvenilia kicking about that nobody's heard. Um, but you make a point really throughout the book, and it sort of builds as you read the book that okay, we're starting off with "Don't Bother Me," but in a certain way, that becomes sort of like an attitudinal template for a whole lot of his music, not all of it. But there is a certain, sort of written in standoffishness, and desire for privacy and desire to even when it's not about that per se, there's sort of a desire to not stand up and be a pop star, but focus on the sort of great religious truths that he's seeking. That in a way is there too. But a few qualities I sort of wrote down as I was reading through the book that all sort of coalesce, which is uh, preachiness, scolding. That's one way you put it. Indefiniteness in the sense of all of those uses of subjunctives in lyrics, uh, in something, I don't. We're saying I don't know. What's
Right.
well,
Hmm.
and then what is life? What I feel I can't say. In that one, it's sort of like it's beyond his ability to grasp this truth and bring it in and make it a succinct rock song lyric, um, but so there are all these things that when I say it like that, it sounds more negative than I think you mean it in the book. But there are those qualities, and you talk about his use of the negative, um, as opposed to negativity, but the negative in the sense of well, what I feel I can't say, that has a negative in it, and so many of his lyrics have that. um, was that something you sort of came upon or discovered as you were working through the book, or did you come to the book with that understanding already in place?
That's a great question. I think um, I was aware of it as on my way towards coming up with the idea that I wanted to write this book and what the book would be. But definitely the more, once I really started working on it, I discovered more and more and realized, wow, it's runs through, obviously not every song, but a good number of songs. The other one that really stands out and was an early one is If I Needed Someone.
Mhm.
If this, if that, had you come, all these conditional, like you say, subjunctive, which I find like I have no idea if George Harrison was conscious that he was writing this way in this very unusual way rhetorically that's songwriters don't usually write. You're hard put to find that kind of thing. And it became something of a signature or a strategy. As I say, whether or not it was conscious or not, he would go back to it over and over again. And I find that fascinating. Anything that's different, and especially given his position as a member of the Beatles and given his position certainly in the early to mid 70s as a huge solo pop star, to be writing these songs which are not the usual stuff of pop songs, even experimental Beatles songs. I mean, these are the furthest out lyrically.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah, you made some observations that I hadn't thought of before, but struck me as true, like that um, "It's All Too Much" would have fit on Sergeant Pepper really nicely,
Mm.
and um, I think there was another. I don't think it was Northern Song, which was recorded then. There was another one that you mentioned that just seemed to sort of be in the spirit of Pepper and psychedelia, even if he was not totally sold on psychedelia as such. Um, so I just wanted to mention, it's not really a question, just a
It's
comment.
okay.
Um, in terms of the Indian stuff or the Indian influence stuff, you talk about what kind of ragas and what kind of raga structures he was using. Is that something that you made a separate study of to be able to do this?
Yes. Yes,
And
somewhat.
and so when you talk about the sort of raga styles of some of his really pop songs, but just the structural. Are they actually, classically correct in their structures as ragas? If you sort of map them out with a structure, will they match, say, something Ravi Shankar might do?
That's a great question. And I certainly don't hold myself out as an expert on Hindustani classical music. Um, and I did, consult some people who know a lot more about this stuff than I did. So I tread carefully in making generalizations about, was his stuff in line with perfect classical structures. But I would say that for the most part, or almost entirely, he was doing a fusion, which Ravi Shankar himself was very interested in, was already investigating because he worked with the great classical violinist
Menuhin.
who, thank you,
Yeah.
even recorded an album around the same time that George first got into this and met him. So he certainly George had the approval, the mentorship, and the collaboration of Ravi Shankar in in creating this raga rock fusion, which George did study, and whether or not everything lined up perfectly with classical structure, probably not, but he did it in a way that Ravi Shankar approved of totally. Even his very first dabbling was in Norwegian wood when he had just bought a sitar. He didn't really know how to play it. He approached it like a guitar, and John saw it sitting around and said, "Hey, why don't you try to play that Indian guitar?" That I believe is what he said on this song. And you know, obviously he wasn't even playing the instrument in the correct fashion. But later on, Ravi Shankar gave him full credit and thought he did a great job, and thought what he did with that song was, was creative and kind of an advancement of this style, which both Ravi and George would continue um, throughout uh, George's career and throughout Ravi's career. The 1974 tour that George did of North America was a co-bill with Ravi Shankar and his ensemble, and they really did fusion music. There was jazz, there was other
Mhm.
kind of world music in it. Um, and there may have been a section where Ravi's ensemble was doing pure raga music, but a lot of it was fusion music of a sort. And at a time when these sorts of things, I mean, that nowadays, or even 30, 40 years ago, that wasn't such a big deal, but 60 years ago it was a really big deal.
Yeah. I mean, Shankar Family and Friends was sort of Ravi going in the opposite direction, going towards pop, Western pop, but with
Exactly.
sort of an Indian. Uh, what interesting thing about Norwegian Wood is that what George does on that is sort of opposite of what you pointed out he normally does in his guitar solos. He just basically plays the melody on the sitar, and you pointed out that in his guitar solos and in Beatles stuff, he tended not to do the melody, but to do a different kind of solo that was, purely his sort of expansion on the chord progression. Um, but I guess the fact that he just played the melody is a measure of how primitive his relationship with the sitar was at that point.
Right.
So I should pass you on to Ken, and perhaps we'll come back for another round.
Okay. First of all, Seth, loved reading the book, and there's a lot in there that I kind of knew, but you really emphasized and brought the points out more. And that is, first of all, George was instrumental at ending Beatles songs with an odd chord. Um, One that's always brought up is She Loves You, because it ends
Hmm.
on a sixth chord, and the Beatles really thought it sounded great, and George Martin didn't want it to end that way. Pop groups don't end with an odd chord like that, but they kind of were really pushing it and insisting on it, and George allowed it to go out that way. But um, he also brought into it odd chords like the very beginning of All I've Got to Do. Like, why start a song with that chord that way and lead it into, the verses and the chorus of that song? It's just a very unusual way to start a song with just some unusual chord like that.
Right.
If you study a lot of what the Beatles did, some of the songs do end with a sixth or a ninth or whatever, and that was mainly George's contribution in that regard.
Hmm. Right. Definitely.
There's even
Yeah.
the BBC recording of P.S. I Love You, which ends with a different chord they stuck on the end there, which
Uh,
wasn't on the familiar version of the song.
right. Right. And of course, the opening chord to A Hard Day's Night,
Sure.
wh- which everybody took part in, but it was really George was the moving force behind it.
Mhm.
And it's the single, probably most recognizable, half second of music in all of popular music. It's no wonder that to this day, Paul McCartney, and Alan, you could speak to this, I'm sure, better than I can, but he has for many years, on and off, chosen to open his concerts
Hmm.
with that song
Right. Not
and
only
that chord.
I didn't realize that when A Hard Day's Night ends with those arpeggios that George plays on the guitar, that's the same chord from the opening chord of the song.
Right, right.
Also,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you wonder, I mean, he was 21, 22 years old when a lot of this went down. I mean, I
Mm.
think when the Beatles were over, he was only 27. Um, so it's pretty amazing. It's such a young age and totally self-taught. I mean, he knew tons of music and not just rock and roll. He
Mm.
knew all the music of the 20th century, partly because his parents were very musical, as were Paul McCartney's parents. Um, but also just because, he was a sponge. And that's one of the things, and I write about this in the book, that the Beatles were a little bit different from some of the other early English rock groups of their time, who were tended to be very blues based or just, very pure rock and roll or stemming from that and bringing it. Whereas the Beatles incorporated the entire, not just popular music of the 20th century, but, but jazz and brass music and Rubber Soul is almost like a world music album. Not only do you have uh, Norwegian Wood with the sitar, so it's kind of like raga rock, but you've got Michel, so it's got a very French flavor to it. And then which is the one? Is
Girl.
it Rain? What?
There's Girl with the bouzouki sound.
Girl, thank you. Yes, with the Greek music sound to it.
You think that it in the early Beatle days, John used to come out a lot and say, "Yeah, we hate trad jazz," and yet you would see George bringing something like that opening chord to All I've Got to Do. Do you think that if John didn't have that attitude towards jazz that he expressed so openly and so frequently, that George might have actually pushed them a little more towards jazzy chords because he seemed interested in playing them, and using them?
Yeah. Well, I think he did a fair amount of it, and I think to to some extent, I think John, and anything John said or any of them said in interviews, you always have to take it with a grain of salt. But I wonder if John's hatred of trad jazz was as much or more of kind of a social comment on what it stood for and the people who played it,
Mm.
rather than just disliking the music itself. I don't know,
Mm.
but there was that kind of opposition at the time. Um, and John was also dismissive, as you know very well, of Paul's granny music.
Mhm.
Whatever he applied that to.
Right, right.
And yet you study the Beatles' whole catalog, especially the solo music, and there's so much that they were influenced that's pre-rock and roll. You take a look at George Harrison covering Hoagie Carmichael and covering Cole Porter
Right.
and between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea and songs like that, and it's mixed into his solo music. Um, Also, you mentioned there's an emphasis on the first lyric, first line of lyrics in George's songs, and
Hmm.
how important they were. They really set the tone for what the song's about. I mean, you mentioned I Want to Tell You and
Yeah.
Life, and they're very similar in a way with how they open with what George is saying. So that was something he was very conscious of as he was writing.
Right. Absolutely. And he had a gift for that. And again, I don't know if this was something that he planned or it was intuitive or it's just the way things came out, but it becomes quite there's a through line of this throughout so many of his songs.
Yeah. I never really thought about it until you put it in your book, but
Yeah.
um, there's one thing I wish I wrote down the exact page, but it's early in your book where you're talking about how George used to call him and Ringo the economy class Beatles, and you try to bring out the fact that George and Ringo added so much to the band. It wasn't just John and Paul's band. But if it had been most other bands with two other members, with John and Paul up front, it would have been more like backing the Everly Brothers.
Hmm.
But
Right.
saying that, you realize how much George and Ringo contributed. And very often I'll think about it's so easy to get swept up in the song with the Beatles, and you're singing along with all these songs, and you don't realize what's going on underneath it. Like a song like She Loves You, what George is playing while the words are being sung, you don't really hear that as much, but you'd hear a lead guitar solo. That can stand out,
Right.
but a lot of people don't really pay close attention to what goes on while everything else is going on, while you might be singing along with these songs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay. Um, Trying to think. Uh, there's a few times here in the book where I kind of feel like you're putting a dig in there to Paul.
Oh.
I don't know if that's, intentional, but like you'll talk about an album like Red Rose Speedway in there, and aside from My Love, what does anyone really know from an album like that,
Mm.
aside from the hardcore fan? And I got to tell you, as someone who's and Darren and Allan will attest to this, what my favorite album of all time is. I reluctantly say, aside from the hardcore fan, who knows anything other than Give Me Love from that album,
Well,
unfortunately.
what about the title track? I mean, that I think got a lot of airplay.
When it first came out,
Uh,
you
yeah.
know, I say this, it's a sad fact,
Uh-huh.
aside from the people who are more loyal hardcore fans who really go and study it. But as far as what gets played on mainstream radio, whatever, you'll never hear that stuff, or the
Mm-hmm.
Beatles channel or my radio show. You don't
Mm-hmm.
really hear those songs that much. So, there are times when, like you mentioned, Mary Had a Little Lamb in there. Like there's like a little dig to that. And same thing with the Mind Games album, calling that second-rate Lennon, which I don't agree with. I love the
Did
fact
I
that
say that?
Did. And
I love the
also that,
fact,
and also that, all you need is love and imagine are banal. You're entitled.
yeah.
Everyone, we
Yeah.
all have opinions, and we don't all agree, even among us. So hey, that's what makes
Yeah.
people go around.
Sure.
But but
I mean,
the
Seth, my
striking.
one of my least favorite Beatles songs is Yesterday. So
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, with Imagine, I found that great quote from Elvis Costello to back me up.
That's right.
And he's not chopped liver, and especially when you're talking about the Beatles. And especially, I mean, when you're talking about a collaborator, a Paul McCartney songwriting collaborator.
Yeah, and I always thought Elvis Costello was a lot closer to John than to Paul, as a stylist, as a
Mm,
kind of writer. So I hadn't seen that quote before, and it surprised me, but interesting. Mhm.
right, right, right.
Yeah. Well, you actually refer to Yesterday as an outlier.
And the context was because it was no other Beatles were on it. Is that what I was
I
saying?
guess you think of it less of a Beatles song.
Well, because I believe, and Alan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I certainly read that there was discussion. I think it was George Martin's idea
Hmm.
to put Yesterday out as a solo track, not as a Beatles song, but as the first Paul McCartney solo track, which, you know, well,
Well,
who
and
who can say,
in the world
but
of Philip Norman's Paul McCartney biography, it actually did come out as a solo track.
oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway.
No, but one of the great things about the Beatles, who broke all the rules, is that you can put out a song that only had one Beatle or two Beatles or whatever, and
Hmm.
it's still Beatles.
Nothing wrong with that, I don't think,
So
at the time
I was just wondering why you referred to it that way, because to
as an
me,
outlier. I don't remember the context. I'm sorry.
that's okay. Darren?
um Yeah, I'm just thinking about all the heat that I took for saying that to me yesterday was one of my least favorite Beatles songs.
Hmm.
I think last year we did a show where we talked about some of the things that were our least favorites, and Ken and Allan practically fell off their chair. But to me, melody-wise, I never thought it was a particularly interesting song yesterday. Um, but well, back to George Harris. Um, there's this and I'm sure this is definitely something that well, no, we know that this was something that was frustrating George at the time, that he was hidden in the shadow of John and Paul in the same band. I mean, and think about that. How many bands can you come up with that are coming at you with John Lennon and Paul McCartney and still have George Harrison, almost like a secret weapon on the bench that, can't get the time necessary. Uh, but Harrison's songwriting talents to me were so, um, I wouldn't say they were fully formed, but they sure as heck formed very quickly for a guy who had so few opportunities to let his voice be heard. Um, to come up with a song like Taxman in 1966, up to that point, up to Revolver, how many roughly, I mean, guesstimate, how many George Harrison songs on Beatle albums had come out up to that point? I don't even think he was up to 10 yet.
I was going to say half a dozen maybe.
Yeah, well, around that. That's not much. And if I
Right.
don't know how much writing George did quietly on his own time, and things that he then threw out or put aside, and how much writing he did that could be considered practice. But what a leap on Revolver,
Hmm.
musically with something like Love You Too, and lyrically with something like Taxman,
Right.
you know.
Right.
Um, Not a political song, but topical.
Hmm.
How many of those had the Beatles come up with up to that point?
Right. It's hard to find them.
There might be one that I'm not thinking of right now that kind of maybe sort of. And then just a couple of years later, other than maybe Revolution, which would have would have beat the White Album because it came out first, there's George with Piggies making political commentary, and
Yeah.
again, a guy who on the surface, on paper, didn't seem to have enough um experience with writing, and then all of a sudden come out with something like Taxman. When you were writing this book, w w and I'm reading your book and I'm thinking of these things that amaze me about Harrison's songwriting talents. When you were writing the book, what were some of the things that really you didn't expect to learn that blew your mind?
Okay, that's a great question. And this also relates back to a lot of what you were just talking about. And that is that one of the, I went into it to early on to some extent feeling that I wanted to not so much boost George Harrison, but, obviously to enhance people's appreciation for him, but I felt that he needed that he hadn't gotten his full due, both, in terms of critically, but also during the time of the Beatles. And my answer, what I learned might be very surprising to you or to readers. And that is that when you really understand how the Beatles came together, and in particular how George, what his role when he came into the group, I guess the Quarrymen, and then, as it developed into the Beatles, George Harrison was never a songwriter. He was never considered to be a songwriter. It was very clear from the beginning that this group was a vehicle for the songwriting of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. George Harrison was hired because he was very skillful at guitar. He could even tune the instrument, which not all the Beatles could do at that time. So if I bore any kind of resentment against Lennon and McCartney for suppressing George Harrison, which is kind of the conventional narrative, I don't feel that strongly about that anymore. I think that, look, the fact is they hired a guitar player. They didn't hire a third songwriter. And the fact is he didn't write songs. He early on he did write an instrumental, or co-wrote an instrumental, "Cry Like a Shadow," which was really one of their very first recordings. But, "Don't Bother Me" was his very first attempt at songwriting, and that wasn't until their second album. So, people say, "Oh, they didn't give him that many songs." And I'm like, well, wait a minute. He recorded approximately 24, approximately 25 songs with the Beatles. So, or they were released. He may have recorded more than that. And all of that is extra to what his role in the band was supposed to be. So, if anything, I have more of an appreciation and understanding for Paul and John. And it's obviously with the Get Back movie and with the hidden recording of Paul and John talking about George's role in the group. They're actually, very concerned about him and what they may or may not have done at that point. And, this is obviously towards the very end. This is January 1969, so it's the last year that they're working together. But the fact is that he did wind up writing and, recording and getting 2 songs an album or 3 songs on a couple of albums towards the end. And that was more than anybody bargained for. So, and yes, he did then have a backlog of songs that he did introduce to the group, and that they even did rehearse and there are demos of some of them, and some of them are great. But, for whatever reason, but the point simply being that he built this catalog of songs, which he was then able to draw upon in large part on All Things Must Pass. And then on albums all the way through the 1970s, he was still going back and reviving songs that hadn't ever actually seen the light of day, for better or worse. But, so what? We got to hear them, and we got to hear them in his solo versions.
Well, another point as songwriter that I think in recent years, definitely since George's passing, people have been turned on to this fact about George. But and I think you at the beginning of the interview we sort of you know you made mention of this fact, the fact that his first song as a Beatle is "Don't Bother Me" is that's sort of a kind of a heavy negative sort of brushing aside before he ever really got a taste of stardom. Comes out with this song, and before um, John is singing "I'm a Loser," George is saying, "Hey, don't bother me." I mean, an interesting bit of confidence he shows there. Later on, in the mid '60s, he's writing songs like "Isn't It a Pity," which talk about something that, then turned up later on All Things Must Pass. And you listen to it when it was brand new. And honestly, I was 5 years old when that single came out. I knew the single first. And even as a 5-year-old, and I knew the Beatles had broken up, it sounded to me like he was commenting on on the Beatle breakup. But here's George Harrison 5 years before that already thinking in such very heavy terms. Isn't it a pity the way we break each other's hearts? And um, that the substance in his songwriting was very alive and growing even before maybe the other two Beatles were even aware that George was capable of this type of songwriting. Would you agree with that?
Well, it goes back to what I was saying earlier towards the beginning of our conversation about how, for whatever reason, um, he was he's he wrote from his heart and he wrote from his soul and he wrote from his emotions. He wrote from his real life. He wrote from his business situation, with whether he's complaining about taxes or whether he's complaining about the publishing deal he has with Northern Songs.
Mhm.
So yeah, in that sense, I do see that as so, something for the most part unique in the group. The other guys, were doing different things, but not that. And I don't think, I guess John to some extent got more personal in his solo career.
Mhm.
I don't know, obviously I've heard Paul McCartney's music the whole time. I don't know. I mean, there are clear love songs about Linda and maybe Nancy more recently. Um, but besides love songs, which, the Beatles did a lot of love songs, in terms of the more complicated stuff, George bit off these real sophisticated emotional queries. You mentioned something, and I can't, I get more and more amazed at how, here's a song that Frank Sinatra called the greatest love song of the last 50 years or the greatest love song of the 20th century. And if you actually read something, if you listen to the lyrics, it's anything but a love song. Like, if you're writing a love song, do you say, "You're asking me, will my love grow? I don't know. I don't know. Stick around. It may show. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know." What kind of a love song is that? What the person on the receiving end of that love song, are they supposed to feel good about that? Or are they supposed to think, this guy is having a bit of a commitment. He's a commitment phobe.
Can
He
I
was,
just add that
yeah,
during the Revolver period, George was starting to write The Art of Dying.
I was just going to say that. It's funny you mentioned that. Yeah.
Such a heavy song for him to write. Although Allan pointed out a few years back, here's George writing a song like that, and John's writing She Said with I Know What It's Like to Be Dead at the same time.
Right.
And then Yellow
Interesting you
Submarine.
mentioned that. Of course,
Yeah,
we all
that's,
know the
yeah,
I know what it's like to be dead is
yeah.
at least I don't know if it's an urban myth or urban legend, but supposedly that was Peter Fonda
Right.
on acid, like saying to saying that over and over to John. And George Harrison helped John write that song too.
Mhm.
John was stuck, and well, that's the whole thing that they're talking about. That Paul and John are talking about in the secret tape when Paul admits that he was hurt, that John called up George to help him with she said, and not Paul, and how that sort of caused a bit of a rift.
Hmm.
You know,
One of
Red Snake.
many, one of many things that cause rifts, amongst all of them.
You mentioned Ken, the Revolver period. And Revolver had "Love You Too" on it, which I mean George was keeping right up with the Joneses there, while John was drawing up "Tomorrow Never Knows." I mean, when it comes to weirdness, circa 1966, George was right up there. That was a tie, those two
Hmm.
songs. Let's talk about, I want to ask you a question about George Harrison, the guitar playing, because I also hear very quick maturation as a guitarist when I'm listening to the Beatles. His playing to me on the very early recordings, and I'm going to get probably criticized for this, on occasion seemed a little sloppy.
Mhm.
There was some things on those early recordings where I'm not a guitarist, but heck, they sounded like mistakes to me. Blown notes or maybe a dead chord or something here and there. And then all of a sudden that was gone. And George suddenly became a unique stylist. And like you mentioned a little while ago, adding this sitar in there even before he really knew how to plop. He before he actually knew how to properly play the instrument. Um, and as a guitarist, how would you say, because you're a musician as well, I understand, right? You're in a couple of bands, and um, can you kind of, in a nutshell, give us a little bit of a summarization of him as a musician, his growth? We've been talking all about his lyrics and his
Yes,
words.
right.
How about the as a guitarist as well?
Sure. Well, I agree with you that the early stuff, it shows a beginner um, making his way through and, building upon Chuck Berry's influence and Carl Perkins's influence and, those guitar players before him who he dove into deep as a way to learn to play and then eventually to develop his own style. So I think what happens is, early on, they're recording these albums like in a day. So there's not a lot of time to work on this stuff or, in his parts, it's just like, okay, George, play something. Now, I think what happens very soon after that, and when you start to hear him not making the mistakes and having more of a controlled sound and writing, guitar lines and arpeggios and contrapuntal lines and lines that answer the vocals. At this point, he's able to assert a certain very basic way that he wants to go about this. So, and it's not that we're going to play these songs live in the studio and I'm going to just like play something and that's it. He starts, laying down the rule, and that is that, okay, we're going to work on this. We're going to get the song down basically. And I'm going to go home tonight and I'm going to spend a few hours or stay up all night. And I'm going to come back tomorrow with a composed instrumental section that I'm playing on guitar. And that's when you find these beautiful riffs and hooks that are as catchy and the songs are as identifiable for that as anything else. And I think, you know, so many of those great guitar lines that instantly that's the Beatles because of that sound. These were things that George worked on as a composer and obviously had the fluency and a style at this point simply because, playing more and more and developing his style and his voice. Uh, so that pretty quickly, by, I don't know, by A Hard Day's Night or Help, and absolutely by Rubber Soul, you're seeing just a consummate guitar player.
Yeah.
And very different from what other guitar players, especially other English rock guitar players, are doing at that time. You know, he, he had this weird lifelong friendship and collaboration with Eric Clapton, and you could not find two musicians who were more night and day, more the antithesis of each other. I'm not saying one thing is better than the other, but whatever they felt for each other as people and understood each other, it didn't extend to them approaching playing guitar in a rock band and on songs. It didn't extend to that. They did it very differently. in those few times when, well, really just the one time when George brought Clapton in to play an instrumental passage on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, what does Eric Clapton do? He doesn't do Eric Clapton. He mimics George Harrison because he has at least the sense and the respect to know that, okay, George wants me to do something here, but this is not Cream. I'm not going to do, the, trying to think of the word, fireworks. That's not well,
Pyrotechnics.
pyrotechnics. Thank you. I'm not going to do a pyrotechnics solo here. I'm going to do a lyrical solo because that's what George would do.
Hmm. Yeah. I never thought of that. True. Excellent. All right. Back to Allan.
Okay. I have a slightly different perspective of what George was hired for and his place as a composer in the group. Um, when he joined the group, although John and Paul had written some songs, they were really basically still a cover band. And it was really just later that the songs became important. And from what I've heard, uh, there was discussion of whether it should be Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and John and Paul voted no.
Hmm.
Um, they each had collaborated on at least one song with him in the past. You mentioned "Cry for a Shadow." There was also the one they
All
recorded,
the danger.
"In Spite of All the Danger." And Paul has said that, well, George got credit for that just because he wrote the solo, and in those days that's the way we did it. My feeling is that they were right in those days, and everything about Beatles compositions, this is a slightly radical thing to say, possibly, really should be rethought. I listened, and I've mentioned this on the show before, but I listened to "And I Love Her," and I am absolutely convinced that George should have a co-writing credit for that
Hmm.
because his guitar figure is central to
Hmm.
that song. Maybe not during the verses, the arpeggiations, which are really nice, but because when people cover the song, they don't necessarily do that. But almost everyone who covers the song does, do 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 do. It's like as you say about the Hard Day's Night chord, it's instantly recognizable as that song, and that's George's contribution. And I think he should have had a writer credit for that. And taking this further, you listen to the drums on Strawberry Fields and Rain and A Day in the Life, and a lot of that is sort of orchestrated drumming too. And Ringo should have a writer credit. So I'm kind of thinking these days that in a certain way, all Beatles originals should probably be credited to all four of them. you know and that should have been done in the beginning, and some groups work like that. I mean, I'm sure you've seen writer credits where like every song on an album it says by, and it'll say the whole group. I think that probably is what the Beatles should have done. It would have provided for a more equitable financial distribution,
For
but
sure.
but more importantly, it would have reflected what everybody was contributing to the band. And I have a feeling, you mentioned something in the book. I can't remember exactly how you put it, but you mentioned, on some songs he was almost like an unofficial collaborator. So I suspect that you might agree with this theory.
I I'm kind of stuck because, when I'm a huge fan of the band, and people talk about this a lot regarding the band because Robbie Robertson wrote pretty much all the songs and he got the songwriting credit. And we know that without Robbie Robertson in the group, there would be no songs by the band. How do we know that? Because when he left, and then they all got back together and were the band for another 20 years without Robbie Robertson. They never wrote an original song the entire time.
Hmm.
They all had outside songwriters. So, yet obviously those records that the band made
Hmm.
are fully the creation of 5 or 6 different musicians, you know. Name any one of them. And obviously, as Levon would often say, Robbie didn't tell Garth Hudson what to play. But I go back and forth because I think, there would be no songs if Robbie didn't bring them in. In the Beatles, there would be no songs basically if John and Paul or John or Paul didn't bring them in. Those are the songs. So those are the songwriting credits. It's almost like you need a different credit, not the mechanical credits, because that's just for playing, just for being there. But you need some kind of credit in between the two,
For
which maybe,
Hmm.
or an arranger credit or something like that.
which somehow accounts for what we're talking about all the other members of a rock band bringing stuff to it that is essential and in the end of you know of equal if not greater import to the success of the song. But this but they didn't write the song. So I go back and forth. I don't feel strongly that George should have gotten co-writing credit for those hooks and riffs just because it just wasn't done. That's not how, I mean, should it have been done? Do we go back and do that? I don't know.
There's a big difference between the actual song, lyrics, and melody and the arrangement and what people bring to it. And it's like for years when I used to watch the Grammy Awards, there'd be Song of the Year and Record of the Year, and they're two completely different things.
Hmm.
When you're talking about the song, the lyrics and melody account for everything. And the great thing about the Beatles is that the songs stand by themselves as songs, whether there's the Beatles arrangement of the songs or the people covering it. Not every version of And I Love Her has to have do 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 do. It can exist without it. You may miss it, but there's so many great cover versions of Beatles songs, and they're not bringing the same things to those songs that the Beatles did. So they're really separate. Otherwise, you'd have to give George Martin a lot of songwriting credits too,
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
what he suggested to do with these songs.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Or actually wrote and contributed.
Mhm.
But let me point out that Imagine, banal or not, is now written by John Lennon and Yoko Ono, and it used to be written just by John Lennon.
Right.
So I don't know. I don't see the world suddenly revamping the entire Beatles catalog for credit. It's just what I think would be equitable for a lot of it, maybe not everything.
Mm.
You know,
Yeah.
Yesterday, maybe not, Blackbird, maybe not, but still,
I need to ask you something, which for so many years I've thought about this, and you do say in your book that the very beginning of Love You Too, which is brilliant, the sitar playing on there, the Indian instruments on there, and you say that's George. But to me, it sounds very advanced at that time for George to play that introduction. Are you absolutely certain that it's him?
Oh, that's interesting. Um, I would assume, like everything in the book that I wrote, that I researched that and made sure that that was the case. But,
Right.
asking me today, do I remember how I came to that conclusion? I don't remember how. If I wrote it, it's because I researched it and found it. Could I be wrong? Yeah, sure. I can't guarantee that everything that I haven't made any mistakes.
I've never heard George or any of the Beatles talk about the beginning of that song.
Mm. I mean, because they did use members of the Asian music circle in London. In particular, on the next album, on Sergeant Pepper, on Within You, Without You,
Right.
the title track of my book. So, which was George and the Asian music circle and not really the other Beatles. I don't recall that being the case on Revolver, but that doesn't mean that it might not have been.
I think
Alan?
U2
Yeah.
gives a credit to the tabla player, but
Right.
doesn't mention another sitarist. So you could possibly presume from that that the sitar would be George.
Mm, good point. Right.
Yeah. I also like the fact that on Within You Without You, I was always curious how George Martin did this arrangement with Western and Eastern instruments and everything. How do you blend those two together? But I wasn't aware that, unless I'd forgotten about it, that George Martin already had experience working with the Asian music circle on a version of Wouldn't It Be Loverly from My Fair Lady.
Mhm.
It was a recording of that, and I didn't even
Right.
know about that. So we already had some experience with Indian instruments.
Yes. Yeah. And I wonder if that somehow, how involved was George Martin in the movie Help, in the music inside the movie, because you have that scene of Indian musicians, and you actually have a sitar version of, I think I wrote this in the book.
Hard
I
Day's
believe
Night.
it's of A
Yeah,
Hard Day's Night
yeah.
Yeah.
in Help.
Hmm.
Good point.
I think it was called Another Hard Day's Night, if I'm not mistaken.
Is that
Yeah.
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Hmm. Was it when it came to picking all the songs that you wanted to discuss in this book, I noticed that when it came to George's Beatles songs, you covered almost all of them.
Hmm.
Still left a few out. And
Hmm.
then because there's so much to cover in one book on George's solo career, you kind of you'd cover an album and mention a few of the songs. Was it difficult deciding which ones you wanted to discuss in the book?
I don't think it was difficult, I listened, and the things that I heard that seemed to have something to say about or comment about, for me, are the ones that I wound up, dealing with to some greater extent. Um, it wasn't, it was never my intention to, go track by track every, and write about every song. There is one book that does that, and it's a pretty great book by Simon Lang. Um, One of the only other George Harrison books that I really have great respect for.
Okay.
Um, uh, but that was never my intention. My intention was more thematic. So if there was something about the songs in some of the later solo career that helped, that were further evidence of through lines of his ambivalent approach to songwriting, of his a great opening line, of his complaining about taxes or the Pope. That was another big
Mm.
favorite of his. He's got at least three songs where he complains about the Pope, if not more.
Yeah, I also wanted to just comment about, I know how easy it is to feel sorry for George in the Beatle years and that whole feeling of, you know, he, John and Paul led the group and he wasn't given that much of a chance to write. And in the very beginning, he wasn't that prolific to begin with. It
Right,
was really, once 66 kicked in and you had the three songs on Revolver and he's starting to write The Art of Dying and he's starting to write Isn't It a Pity? And he's really coming into his own, and Within You Without You to me is one of the greatest masterpieces, which as a kid I couldn't possibly comprehend this song at all. And now I think it's so brilliant. Not,
right,
not only lyrically and musically, but the whole arrangement of what George Martin did with both the Eastern and Western instruments and everything. But yeah, in the very beginning, he wasn't writing that much to begin with. So you could say And we say this now, knowing what Isn't It a Pity became, and what The Art of Dying became. How could they not accept those songs? But it could very well be those songs weren't finished
Hmm.
when George was writing them in 1966.
Right.
So, even the demo of The Art of Dying had a reference to Mr. Epstein in it. So, the lyrics had to be changed somewhat.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. What would you think would be George's greatest contribution from his solo career? Because he already had accomplished the start of world music, as did
Right.
Roger Schenker when he was
Mhm.
in the Beatles, and he was developing the slide guitar towards the end of the Beatles. But what do you think of most when you think of George's solo career? What's the lasting impact beyond putting out great songs?
Well, I don't know that I could just name one. Um, one thing that's a clear, there's a delineation, and that is in his guitar playing in his solo career, when he
Mhm.
basically adopts this totally unique approach to playing guitar with a slide. I don't even want to call it slide guitar
Mm.
because the way George sounds when he plays guitar with a slide is not like anybody else.
Hmm.
It's totally his own signature, his own DNA. And I don't know how he created that, but it's his voice in the musical or literary sense. It's the perfect complement to his themes, to his concerns, to his yearning, to his vulnerability, to his seeking, you know, that inquisitive tone
Mm.
that he plays. So there's that. And where are we introduced to it, and where is it probably to a large extent the most effective? On All Things Must Pass. And I would also partly answer your question by just saying All Things Must Pass was just one of the most amazing rock albums ever.
Sure.
And it it did a lot of things. It's fascinating in so many ways. Here he was a year after the Beatles, making an album which, did not really sound and very much like the Beatles. I mean, parts of it sound a lot more like the band, and we know that
Hmm.
he
Yeah.
went to Woodstock, hung out with them. Everybody loved the band. Eric Clapton went to Woodstock because he wanted to join the group, forgetting that they actually already had, in my estimation, one of the world's greatest rock guitarists in the group. Darren gives the thumbs
Yeah.
up to that. But there is that, the Phil Spector influence to some extent, but from George's point of view as a writer, he's channeling girl group sounds and Motown sounds and the band, and but it all coheres, and he will continue doing this throughout the 70s to a lesser and greater extent. It depends, and
Mm.
maybe not ever to I think living in the material world is pretty coherent,
Hmm.
but everything else after that, it's got its strong points and often very strong points, and as we said, one of you said earlier, maybe the weak points are weaker at that point.
I have a theory um, that of the four, when they broke up and went solo, um, George was the most consistent of the four of them. John definitely had his peaks, and there's a valley or two in there in the solo discography. Same thing with McCartney. Of course, McCartney having such a huge career, having the good fortune to be still with us and really never stop making music. I think it's almost a given. When you're making music that long, you're going to hit some valleys. You're going to have peaks. They're unavoidable. John didn't have that much time, but I think a lot of people will say that Sometime in New York City was a misstep of an album for Lennon. And Ringo had peaks and valleys too. They were to a minimum, these highs and lows when it came to George. In my mind, George was always at a consistent level
Mm.
where even his weaker albums, whether you think, for me, Extra Texture was his weakest, and even that had enough strong moments on it
Hmm.
that I could put on Extra Texture and not think of it as being, oh, let me give this one a spin because I feel bad for it. No, definitely has its moments on there. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but I felt that he was the most consistent of the four of them that put out, I think, had the best body of work as a result of that when you're talking maybe just strictly albums. And right to the very end, I mean, even an album like Brainwashed, which I find very difficult to listen to only because I know that it was released after he died. But had he still been alive and well and put that out, be like, this guy doesn't miss a step. You
Right,
know,
right.
Brainwashed would be right up there with all of them in my book. They're all up there.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
and you point out All Things Must Pass. Everyone views that as one of the all-time great records. It is All Thing, but for me, I always thought the perfect album that George did was 33 and a Third.
I love that album.
George got funky, kind of embraced American R&B a little bit, even dare I say contemporary jazz a little bit
Hmm.
on that album. But it's always been my theory that he was the most consistent of the four and has the most enjoyable catalog that you could sit and listen to from beginning to end and say, really, there wasn't a stinker in there, when I'm talking about full albums.
Yeah. No, I agree totally. And I always try to shy away from making it a competition amongst the four of them, but we can certainly say in absolute terms that George had a great consistent or inconsistent but still great at its best line. Yeah, you're right, throughout his entire solo career. Cloud Nine was utter shock and surprise. And my only complaint about Cloud Nine, it's not so much the songs, it's the production, which I'm not thrilled by.
You don't like Jeff Lynne's production?
No.
Well, let me ask you this question. When it came out in 87, did you
Yeah.
feel that way then?
I think I did,
You did?
I mean, because I actually appreciate Electric Light Orchestra and ELO. But I think then, right in the moment, as now, I listen to Cloud Nine and other stuff and even some of the Traveling Wilbury stuff, and it's like, why? And some of the stuff from the remakes on Anthology of the demos into Beatles songs that Jeff Lynne produced, and it's like, why do these things sound like ELO?
Yeah.
Here is a guy who worshipped the Beatles, talking about Jeff Lynne, you know, and was so thrilled to be able to take part. Then why is he making them sound like ELO and not like themselves or, in those 1990s
Mhm.
songs like the Beatles?
I kind of felt like you did, but a little later, like when Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers put out Into the Great Wide Open. Now we're into the early 90s, and now you're like, oh, it's a Jeff Lynne production. I love Jeff Lynne. I know I'm going to like this. But by the early 90s, I'm like, okay, just get Bev Bevan and Richard Tandy and put the Electric Light Orchestra back together again, Jeff. Because in a way, you're making ELO records through other people. That I didn't feel that way with Cloud Nine, but it came a few years after that,
Mm.
by the early 1990s. Um, it's something I guess that great producers have to walk that line between sounding like a a production of yours or sounding like the artist you're producing,
Right.
you know. And we talked about this when we were talking about the new Ringo Starr album. As brilliant of a producer that T-Bone Burnett is, I always felt that T-Bone got locked into a sound. Um, and I don't know if you're familiar with Robert Plant's album Band of Joy, but Band of Joy was a record where I was like, okay, everything's starting to sound the same. The T-Bone Burnett's fingerprints are on.
Mm-hmm.
The drums sound like they're underwater. There's a certain "Oh Brother, We're Out There" feel to everything he's touching. And it then seemed like he backed off. And Look Up is a gem, and I don't feel the way I do about it. But Jeff Lynne was a good example of that. Somebody that came in, started producing others, and yet everything was becoming Electric Light Orchestra. I mentioned this last show. I think when we talked about, um, I mentioned it at some point recently. I don't even remember what I did 2 hours ago. Um,
We talked
that
about Look Up.
I think George said to Jeff, "Here's the rough sketches of Brainwashed. Please don't make it an Electric Light Orchestra album." I remember reading that it was a quote that he told Jeff to not turn it into an ELO record.
I
And
love that.
Brainwashed really, it sounds like Jeff kept it in check. Or,
Yes.
but
Yeah. It's interesting because what I what you were talking about, it definitely is a fine line when a producer has a sound and an approach that he or she brings to a lot of his different projects. And what I'm thinking of somebody who I find it actually works, and that is to a large extent Danielle Lanois.
oh
Like,
yeah,
think about Emmylou Harris's Wrecking Ball. I mean, that is a Danielle Lanois album as much as it is an Emmylou Harris album, but it's fantastic, I
yeah,
think.
yeah.
You know,
I agree with you.
you wouldn't want every Emmylou album to sound like that, but that was just, a perfect blend. And his work with he did a Neville Brothers album, didn't he?
Right, Yellow Moon,
Yep. And and I think his work with Dylan, with Oh
Oh
Mercy
Mercy.
and Time Out of Mind. Um,
Yep. Oh Mercy to me it was kind of funny the way Dylan had put out Knocked Out Loaded and Down in the Groove, which a lot of people like to zing those two albums, maybe deservedly so. And then Daniel Lanois comes into the picture and there's this brilliant Oh Mercy. And then Daniel leaves and Dylan does Under the Red Sky, which was there a song on there? Wiggle Wiggle. What's the
Wiggle Wiggle.
Wiggle Wiggle on Under the Red Sky? So yeah, I wish I don't know where he's kind of been laying low, Daniel Lanois in recent years, and I
Hmm.
am a fan and miss hearing his work. But anyway, we're getting off topic
But
with
can I just say, where
yeah,
Cloud9 is concerned, part of the reason why that album was so successful,
yeah,
coming from someone who always says the song is more important than the production, but it's Jeff Lynne's production that made George sound more contemporary,
Yeah,
which is
absolutely.
probably what George was looking for. Not so much cashing in on trends, because George is not like that. But I have a feeling that if Cloud9 had sounded production-wise like 33 and a Third or the George Harrison album or Somewhere in England, that it
yeah.
wouldn't have done as well.
No, you're right.
But when I listen to, say, Tom Petty's Full Moon Fever, I'm not saying that's an ELO album to me.
No.
No,
So
no. But after a few hours, I think as the years went by, when Roy Orbison starts sounding like ELO-ish and Del Shannon,
hmm,
right? Isn't there a Del
yeah.
She? And then I singled out Into the Great Wide Open for me because I just thought that's a bit of a later period of when Lynn was popping up on so many albums. It started by that point going like, okay, everything now this sounds like Full Moon Fever too,
Hmm.
the Into the Great Wide Open album. Full Moon Fever was genius. That Cloud9, and that was the peak of Jeff Lynne's time. But then after a while, it was too unique of a sound, I think.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I also say All Things Must Pass Phil Spector had a lot to do with the success of that album. Even though George later said maybe there's too much of that wall of sound in there and he wanted it held back a little bit, but what Phil Spector applied to All Things Must Pass was perfect for those songs.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you can't just look at the way we feel now, or some people feel now. Oh, it would have been better without the Phil Spector production. It probably wouldn't have done that well without Phil Spector's production.
Right.
Right.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
So Seth, I had one other observation in a way. When Ken was mentioning about how with the Beatles stuff you didn't cover every single song, but what I sort of noticed was that sometimes I'd be reading along like the White Album period and saying, well, but where's Savoy Truffle? But then at the end of the book, when you're talking about more thematic things. I believe in this case it was about George's songs about the Beatles. Uh, Savoy Truffle comes up.
Mhm.
So some of the things that you know seem to have been skipped turned up anyway later.
Right.
But the thing about George writing about the Beatles is, with the exception of maybe Ballad of John and Yoko. I don't think John and Paul wrote about the Beatles much
Right.
or about themselves, but George did a bunch, you know?
He did a bunch in the Beatles and then he did a bunch outside of the Beatles.
Right,
And and he wrote songs before they were necessarily about the Beatles and then they became about the Beatles just because of cosmic coincidence. Most obviously All Things Must Pass,
right, right,
which the Beatles, you hear them and see them rehearsing that song in January 1969. And they actually do a really great version of it. He tells them to make it bandy, make it like the band,
mhm,
and they do. And they have, you know, um, Paul or John sounds like Rick Danko or Richard Manuel on harmony.
mhm.
Um, and I lost my train of thought.
The song All Things Must Pass, making it sound bandy.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. But we were talking about, Beatles, writing about the Beatles. So, this song that he had written about. Now, was he thinking that the Beatles were going to break up when he wrote that song? Probably not. I
Mhm.
mean, not at that time. They weren't, you know,
Right.
they all, maybe not all, maybe not John, but the rest of them all thought that they were going to continue on as a recording group and were willing to do that, as
I
far
think
as I
I think
understand.
I think that given his willingness to say specifically Beatle, Beatle complaints, if that's what he's going to do, like in Not Guilty or something, that if he meant that to be about the Beatles, he would have mentioned something in the lyrics, but it seems more philosophical. Sunrise doesn't last all morning, cloudburst doesn't last all day. He doesn't. He seems to be sort of beyond the world of the Beatles here. He's, talking about all things must pass away as part of his, the spiritual study.
I agree absolutely. The only thing is, in the context of how things went down,
Oh yeah,
and then the choice of calling his first solo album, not calling it George Harrison, but calling it All Things Must Pass a year after the Beatles break up. He's making a statement that way, whether or not it's, the song itself is about that.
right.
He's choosing that, choosing to open the album, the very first track you hear with a Bob Dylan co-write
Hmm.
is a clear, pointed statement saying, okay, well, now it's Harrison and Dylan instead of, Lennon and McCartney. And, I've got Bob Dylan in my corner.
And yet you don't think that "I Me Mine" is one of his songs about the Beatles.
I think, it could be, but it so much fits in with just his beliefs and feelings about egotism and, his more spiritual and Hindu religious Hinduism philosophical viewpoint. So I think it's as much or more out of that wellspring as it is necessarily about you know digging at his bandmates. But how will we ever know?
Right.
Could you answer why you feel, and I could agree with you on this. You said What Is Life is the greatest production that Phil Spector ever did on any record. I love the sound of What Is Life, but coming from someone that produced a lot of masterpieces, you know.
I don't I don't remember that I said that, but if you say I did, then I guess I did.
I'll
Um,
find the exact quote here, but I know you said it there in
I do think it's one of the greatest, and I think it's one of the greatest produced and exciting and dynamic, you know, pop rock songs for sure. It
hmm,
just, it comes out like I write, and it's almost inexplicable. I almost can't fathom what it is about that opening riff, and then and then all that the guitar stuff that goes on with both rhythmically and lead wise, and then goes into the song itself. It's so exciting, but it's so timeless. It could have been any time.
Mhm.
It could have been 1962. It could have been it's somewhat of a Motown song in a lot of ways. It's got a girl group thing going on. But then it's got all the other stuff. It's got the horns, which is Phil Spector very much.
hmm.
So yeah, and like I write, and I can't explain this. I remember hearing it in the 70s and thinking, "Oh, I've heard this song before," even
Mhm.
though I didn't. It was a new song.
Hmm.
It just and I don't know if I'm the only one, but it just has that timeless quality for me.
Okay.
I I know that Phil Spector went on like in the 70s. He produced a Ramones album,
Mm.
and he produced a Dion album and Leonard Cohen. Um, but I always thought that All Things Must Pass was the last great stand for Phil Spector,
Hmm.
his last great work as a producer. Just a random observation.
Makes sense. Makes sense. He had a good run.
What about Imagine?
How much did Spector really do to Imagine? I mean, there's some thinking that before the Plasticono Band album, that he didn't really do all that much, Spector. And if there was ever an album that Spector's name is on it that you could say, I don't, I think Spector's input on those two Lennon albums was kind of a little minimal.
I think
That's
there's
not,
a
you
difference.
know what I'm saying, right?
Plastic
Well,
Ono Band, from what I understand, you know, that's as raw an album as you can get.
yeah,
You
and
can have
Spector
a raw
really,
sound on it. But Imagine has a lot of
and
produced.
it's lush.
Yeah,
But it's I don't know, controlled is not the proper way of I don't think is a good description of it, but it's a controlled production. That's why I don't tend to think of um I don't tend to think of Phil Spector much with Imagine, even though yeah, he did have his fingerprints on it.
hmm.
So maybe you could say that Imagine was uh you know a fine job there, and I like the ones I pointed out. I'm not saying, I mean, it's kind of awkward sounding him with the Ramones and stuff, but it seemed like All Things Was Past was the last time that anyone really heaped praise on Phil as the producer. Um, but Imagine's a valid argument against what I just said.
Okay. And also from the Living in the Material World box set, we discovered that Phil was there throughout the sessions, even
Right.
if he wasn't given a co-production credit except on Try Some Buy Some, which
Mm,
was done a few years earlier.
right.
Um, yeah. Um, Based on what you wrote in your book, you can write, I think, an entire book on your defense of George with the My Sweet Lord lawsuit. You want to just say, if you can, concisely, why you think George should never have lost the copyright infringement case?
All you got to do is listen to those two recordings. And there's virtually no resemblance at all. I mean, one song starts with do lang, do lang, do lang. One song starts with, first of all, an incredible guitar figure, which is indelible and imprinted on everybody's brain. Down, 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 down.
Hmm.
And when the song itself starts, the first words are, My sweet Lord, I really want to see you. So how do you get that? And how do you get do lang, do lang, do lang, do lang, do lang? It's not, the vibe is totally different.
I get that. The production is very different, but
Everything about it is so different.
I'm only thinking of, the melody line, da da da, da da, the same three notes, and then da 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 da. It's not exactly the same because chords do change in My Sweet Lord. Believe me, I didn't want George to lose this case. I think of them
Mm,
as two very different songs in a lot of
yeah.
ways, but melodically, there's a similarity there. And how did you feel about John Lennon saying, George isn't stupid, he knew what he was doing?
So John Lennon knew what he was doing with Come Together.
He
Yeah,
did.
he did.
Yeah.
Sure, he did. They knew it, and even Paul said that he wanted to
Paul
disguise
warned him.
it
Yeah.
by slowing it down.
Hmm.
John knew.
Yeah. But there you've got like entire lines of lyrics which were lifted right out of Chuck Berry's song.
Oh,
Here
that
come all
was
flat top.
Only a couple of lines, it's not a lot, but
Well, it's the opening line.
I
Like,
always found it interesting that George never really caught much flack for something in the way she moves as a lyric.
um,
And yet James Taylor had the song Something in the Way She Moves.
right.
And yet there was never really a lot of controversy or discussion about that.
Again, the songs are so different. And, James Taylor himself has said, his song, I don't know if it's the final line but it comes at the end of either a refrain or a bridge, you know, she's in love with me and I feel fine.
Oh, right. Okay.
He quotes the Beatles
Yeah.
in that song. So
hmm.
turnabout is fair play.
Right, right, right. I forgot that. That's true. Hmm.
I understand there was a TV special. I didn't see this when it was broadcast, but Tom Snyder did a special when he had his own show on at the time about the lawsuit, and he had all these songwriters on there defending George.
Hmm.
Shouldn't have lost the case, and I wish I could see this
Yeah, wow.
on YouTube or anything. But yeah, I thought it was unfair, but I
And
did.
then, of course, the insane stuff with Alan Klein.
Mhm.
At
Yes,
first, being in George's corner and being his manager and, being a part of the defense, only to secretly buy the song and then become the plaintiff in the plagiarism suit.
yes.
You know, utter and total insanity.
Mhm.
They study this. My wife is an attorney, and she says they study this case in law school.
Hmm.
Well, yeah.
Interesting.
Okay. I want to just ask something about George as a person because, you talk about ambivalence, and it's my opinion that we're all complicated when you get down to it.
Hmm.
But there's so many different sides of George. as a person. There's a side that when the Beatles broke up, he didn't want to talk about the Beatles. He downplayed the Beatles, and yet he'll write a song like "When We Was Fab,"
Right.
or he'll be in the Dark Horse video, and he'll put the Sergeant Pepper uniform on,
Yeah.
something like that. So sometimes he'll talk about the Beatles, and he'll say something like, "We had a few good tunes," you know, and then he'll show pride in it, or he'll want to bring back the sound of the Beatles and When We Was Fab and something like that. The same person who um, loves something as serene as gardening is the same person that loves autocar racing and being in the car,
Yeah.
just watching it. The
Right.
opposite extremes of George Harrison. The same person who could be so serious one minute has this wicked sense of humor and loves Monty Python. This is all part of who George Harrison was.
Hmm.
Is he hard to figure out, in your opinion? Do you know where he stands on certain things?
Well, I think he himself addressed this. He was aware of his seemingly internal contradictions, and he would often talk about it in terms of being a Pisces.
Yes.
And because I'm a Pisces too,
Uh-huh.
the symbol for Pisces are two fish swimming in opposite directions,
Mm,
but they're connected, and so a Pisces person has that kind of duality,
right.
and I think that George was aware of that, um, and he was complex. He wasn't easy to pin down in that sense, and it just makes him more interesting.
He's definitely very interesting. Do you think that, on the one hand, I think George recorded music that pleased himself first. He cared about that more so than I think the record sales. But at the same time, there are moments in his solo career when he went out and pushed and promoted himself, like 33 and a third,
Mm,
going on
yeah,
Saturday Night Live and performing with Paul Simon and making the videos for …. And certainly Cloud Nine, he did a lot of promotion there. And then there are albums where he did nothing, like on,
nothing.
so did success matter at all to him, or were there just times when maybe he was pressured by the record company to do promotion? I don't know.
Well, he was definitely, we know he was pressured at times by the record company because there was the one album, and I forget exactly which one it was, late 70s, early 80s album, which he turned it in and they said, well, you got to redo
Oh, somewhere
three
in England.
songs on this album.
Yeah.
So there was that. Did George himself care? I mean, I think he obviously cared to a certain extent, but again, maybe it's that balance between caring, sure, if people like what he does, I don't doubt that didn't please him, but was he going to sell out? And what does that even mean? What does that even mean?
Mhm.
If you're George Harrison, how do you sell out?
Hmm.
You know, I
You
guess if
probably
he,
don't because, like when he I love the fact that and you I think you quoted me saying something like this in the book. The fact that when he had the album rejected, he remade a couple of tracks for them and opened the album with Blood from a Clone, which basically says this is what crap the record industry is.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I mean I would love to be a fly on the wall at Warner when the new version of the album came in and that was the opening track. I'd love to see
unbelievable,
the reaction.
and how that was okay with them. Yeah,
But I think that that probably answers the question about whether he would have sold out. That's his
Mm,
response.
right, right. Yeah,
And how Warner Brothers turned down a song like Flying Hour, which could have easily have been a single. I'm not
Hmm.
saying it would have been number one, but it would have, at least made the top 40 or something.
Uh-huh.
It would have
Uh-huh.
done the same as Blow Away did, It's
Yeah.
just as good.
Hmm.
It's amazing. But, sometimes I think about these things where George is concerned because there are times when he cared, it seemed like, about the record sales, like with Cloud Nine. He did a lot of interviews at the time. And it could just be that this was his first album in 5 years, and Warner Brothers said, "We need you to push this." But I always thought, George, answered to his own tune. He did what he wanted
Mhm.
to do above all. So there's that
You know,
side of him where he did act that way, and there are times when he went along with what the executives wanted.
you know, the song Got My Mind Set on You, which brought him back to not only to the top of the charts, but to number one,
Mhm.
and the last Beatle to this day to have a number one song, unless something McCartney's done recently.
Oh,
The
you're right.
charts today are utterly and totally different from what they used to
Yeah.
be.
Yeah,
Um, so, but in the era when the charts are the way they used to be, now that was just kind of almost, a knockoff tune. They just spontaneously started playing it in the studio.
mm,
It was this old obscure tune. Jim Keltner was playing a drum beat, and George said, "Hey, that reminds me of Got My Mind Set on You." And then they start playing it. And then it becomes the biggest hit in the world.
Yeah. Well,
And so a full-fledged comeback for George Harrison, um, which leads in then into the Traveling Wilburys.
right.
Okay, well, Seth, thanks so much for coming and talking to us about the book. It's a really interesting read, and I think all three of us enjoyed it. You have something planned next? Are you working on another?
I've got a few things that I'm playing around with and that I've been working on for years, but not at the point that I can really talk about it yet.
Okay,
write something about the band. Who said that? Who said that?
we'll keep our eyes out.
Right, right. Thank you guys so much, Darren,
Thank you, Seth.
Ken,
Thank you.
Allan, for
Great.
having me here. It was really great talking to you guys. You know so much, and I learned a lot. And it's fun to bat these ideas back and forth.
Okay, well,
Thank
thanks
you
for
so
coming.
much. Thank you so much, Seth. And hopefully our paths cross in person next time.
I hope so.
Okay, so that was enlightening and interesting, and I enjoyed having a chat with him. I've read a few of his books, and yeah, interesting guy. So we should go around the horn, as Darren likes to say, and give our details and what we're up to, whatever we want. Ken, want to start?
First of all, my other talk show podcast, Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles videocast, with our brand new member, Darren DeVivo, providing so much spark to our show. Really did a great job in his premiere.
Oh,
Uh,
thank
two new shows we just put up. One was our review of Ringo's Look Up. You might say that's kind of late, but we were on hiatus for a while.
Better late than never.
Yeah. So, yeah, and Darren was in that show, and we also did another show as an extra with Tom Frangione, who attended the third show of the three that Paul McCartney performed at the Bowery Ballroom in New York City. So he gave us his review of what went down in the show and, how he felt about the overall performance. Also said Paul's voice was great in that show. Um, So you have those two shows on Talk More Talk. And on my own YouTube channel, Ken Michaels Radio, there's a few new shows that I put up. Speaking of Tom Frangione, and if you want to know why I'm saying Frangione, you're going to have to go back to one of my shows when I had him on recently, because that's what Paul McCartney called him. But it's all explained in that video. But we did a show where we discussed Ringo's concerts at the Ryman Theater, and Tom was there, as was I. Scott O'Rourke, who does his own Beatles show on WUSB, was there, and Jeremy Portorella, who watches this show and Talk More Talk. He's a big fan of ours. We all talked about the shows at the Ryman. Good timing for that because the TV special, as I said, will be on March the 10th on CBS. Also, I did my first trivia show in a year, believe it or not. It's number 11 in the series, my ultimate Beatles trivia show. I had John Borak on, our reigning champion. John is a contributing editor for a Goldmine magazine. He also wrote the book Beatles 100, 100 Pivotal Moments in Beatles History. And also, we had Bob Berger from the Weaklings on that, and Jordan Runtag, who is a podcast king and guru on iHeartRadio. And he actually emceed the big Mind Games event that happened in New York City with some of the musicians that were on it. We got to listen to the box set, many of the recordings on there in advance. So very knowledgeable on the Beatles. So all three of them participate in my trivia show. And I just did another series of mine, which I hadn't done for a year, called the Youngblood Show, where I interview Beatle fans who are 40 and under to get their perspective and opinions on things concerning the Beatles. And I had Owen Lynn on there, who's been a frequent guest on my channel and also on Talk More Talk. And he wrote the book George Harrison in the 1970s. And Kyle Hand, who is an avid fan, just like Jeremy Portorella is. He watches this show, he watches Talk More Talk, he listens to every little thing. So one of our groupies.
I was
And
going to say, he's a Ken groupie.
no, he's our groupie. And yeah, so he's a fan of all of our work. And he was part of that show. So I asked him a lot of simple questions like, what Beatles album have you listened to the most? What solo Beatles album have you listened to the most? Hearing it from younger voices and hearing what they have to say about the Beatles music and their solo music and their history. So that's all on my YouTube channel, Ken Michaels Radio. Also, if you want to listen to my radio show, every little thing, just go to the website for WFDU. That's Fairleigh Dickinson University's college radio station. WFDU.FM is where you go, and they keep two of my archival shows there at all times, which they hold on the channel for 2 weeks apiece. WFDU.FM. And don't forget, Beatles trivia you can find on my website, kenmichaelsradio.com. You can win one of 10 great prizes in all my contests here, including Daytime Revolution, the Blu-ray for that. That is the documentary on the week that John and Yoko co-hosted the Mike Douglas show. And don't forget, we did an interview with Eric Nilsson, who directed this documentary right here on Things We Said Today, which if you haven't watched, you should check out. Also, a couple of items for the Badfinger fans, including the album of demos that was just released, recorded in 1967, 67 through 69.
Right.
How Much is the Sky? And also the other CD, Head First, which was an album, the last album that Badfinger recorded with Pete Ham. Bob Jackson joined the band as a musician then. Joey Mollen had left. It was released in 2000. It actually was supposed to be released by Warner Brothers, but with all the complications they had with their manager and the record company, it didn't come out till 2000. It was remastered by Bob Jackson, just came out. The CD's in my car. I should have had it ready. But anyway, you can win Head First or How Much is the Sky as well on the Beatles trivia and games page of my website at kenmichaelsradio.com. If you can, please email me at everylittlething@att.net if you want to write to me directly. And you can always friend me on Facebook. Just look up my name, Ken Michaels.
Are you giving away the copy that's in your car?
No, I have another one.
Oh, okay, good.
So, Darren?
Darren.
Oh, okay, my turn. Well, now I'm part of not only this show, but Talk More Talk. And if you want to listen to me on the radio, then put it on. If not, don't. WFUV is my radio home. You know what I just realized? It's 41 years on Wednesday. February 26th is the 41st anniversary of my first radio show, which was at WFUV, where I still am. I'm not sure how that happened, but it happened. 1984. So anyway, if you want to listen to me today in 2025, much better than I was in 1984, I'm sure, I'd hope. I'm on the air 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. Monday through Thursday nights, and Saturday afternoons as well. And Saturday is from 1 to 4 in the afternoon at 90.7 FM. And you can also stream at WFUV.org. And look for me on Facebook. I have 2 pages, so one or both of them come on board, and we'll be connected and talk more talk.
Mhm.
Okay. You can reach me on Facebook either under Allan Kozinn, just plain old, or Allan Kozinn Remixed. And there also is a McCartney Legacy Facebook page, and there is a McCartney Legacy website, mccartneylegacy.com or mccartneylegacy.co.uk. You can contact all of us by email at thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com and follow us on Blue Sky. I guess we're just called Things We Said Today at Blue Sky. It's funny, I set up the page, but I can't remember what I called it. I must Things We Said Today because, I'm not that inventive. We also have Facebook page, Things We Said Today video podcast, where we post all the shows the second they go up. And, look for us on YouTube. That's our prime thing. If you just want the audio version, you can check out Podbean. Podbean distributes to iHeartRadio and Apple Podcasts and everybody else. So we're around. You can find us. And if you're listening, you did find us. So there you go. Guess that's about it for me. And so thank you for listening. And for Ken Michaels, Darren DeVivo, I'm Allan Kozinn, and we'll see you next time.
Don't mind me while I arrange Lego flowers.
Yeah.
Before I got started here, I knocked my daughter's vase over here and I messed up the Lego flowers, and now I have no idea what I'm doing.